He is the World Bank Country Director for Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, and Uganda, Qimiao Fan. Good morning, Qimiao.
Good morning, Jambo.
Jambo sana. No. When you say jambo, what do you say? Jambo bwana.
Jambo.
Salama. Habari gani? Jambo is jambo.
Jambo is jambo.
Jambo.
I even got confused. I was like, how do you respond to jambo?
Jambo. Say jambo. Jambo bwana. Karibu sana. We fix the nation here one conversation at a time, including the one that we are about to have with you about Kenya's economic performance and the role that the World Bank and other institutions play in this, and specifically to the World Bank. But to welcome you to the conversation, Janet is going to give you the day's quote. She'll tell you who said what, when, where.
And why.
And why. And let's see what you think of it.
Right. So today's quote is by Elizabeth Wathuti. She's a well-known, phenomenal environmental activist. And in 2019, when she was speaking at the UN Climate Youth Summit, she said, "My truth will only land if you have the grace to fully listen. My truth will only land if you have the grace to fully listen." What do you make of that?
I think obviously it's very, very important, right, to think. For me, I think what's really important is to actually make sure that we, from our perspective, right, so we do evidence-based decision making. I think that's for me that what I would take from there, and that's what we do. An important part of our work. At the World Bank, in many ways, you talk a lot about the World Bank. We are, in many ways, simply a development cooperative that's owned by about 189 countries in the world. That's about 97% of all countries in the world. And members pay in a small, what's called paid-in capital, and they get financing from us. But it's also cooperative in the sense that we learn from each other. We learn from our working across the world in different countries. We take the lessons we learn from one continent to another, from one country to another. And that, I think, it's also a part of that cooperative nature, is we actually learn from each other.
That's good, learning from each other, evidence-based, evidence-led data.
Again, the quote is?
If you're not, I was going to another one. My truth will only land if you have the grace to fully listen.
So it's calling on listen first, listen.
Yeah.
Allow me to express myself, to explain myself, and then you will see my truth.
Yes. And listen.
Qimiao, do you think you are sometimes unfairly judged by people not listening to you first for your truth to land?
Look, I think as a development institution, we work on some of the most challenging development issues. So it's not surprising there'll be some people will not necessarily understand us. But I think for us, I think this quote really emphasizes the importance of us listening to each other, right? And here, again, I think we try to do our best to listen to the stakeholders in the country, the population in particular. Of course, we listen to the government, we listen to the private sector, we listen to the civil society, right? And I think that's a very, very important part of our work. When I talked about the evidence, right? Evidence is not just statistic data, it's also what people think.
And that's right? A lot of different people.
It is, and that's important, right? Because different people will have different views on development issues. Therefore, it is very important to get that diverse view from a range of stakeholders in the society.
Yeah, can I ask, do you think Kenya's current debt to GDP ratio is sustainable? From a World Bank perspective, from your perspective, the debt to GDP ratio, is it something that you think is sustainable?
I think clearly the current debt to GDP ratio is still high. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with debt. The question is how you use that debt, whether that debt is put to productive use that can help you to increase your growth, can help you to create jobs, right? If used efficiently and effectively, that can actually help to create much a bigger pie for the economy, and therefore you will actually have more capacity to borrow. But clearly, currently, I think what's more important when one looks at whether the debt to GDP ratio is sustainable, it's really the trajectory, right? Where it's going. Is it continue to increase? Are the fiscal policies of the country that are helping to gradually reduce that ratio to a level that's sustainable? So when we talk about sustainability, it's not a static issue that should be looked at as a dynamic. It's where it's going.
It's moving.
Yes, indeed.
In May, you released the World Bank Kenya Economic Update with special focus on poverty and distributional impacts of fiscal policy in Kenya. In Kenya, we call that Kisungu Kobo. It's big English, right? But a statement that followed this and accompanied this from the World Bank said Kenya's public debt remains at high risk of distress, with interest payments absorbing about a third of tax revenue. Reforms to strengthen fiscal sustainability in an equitable way while promoting inclusive growth and jobs are critical to revive a slowing economy and a weak labor market. Okay? So you're already raising these red flags. Do you think that our managers of the economy are seeing the same flags that you're seeing?
Well, I hope they do. I think it's, look, if one looked at what's happening, is that Kenya has been able to reduce the debt to GDP ratio from over 70% now to about 66, 67%, right? And I think that's a good direction to go, is to gradually to reduce that. But clearly, we believe that the current reduction in that ratio needs to be even more for it to be sustainable. And as you said, quoted in that report, if a country is spending about 33%, a third of its revenue just paying interest, that means you actually don't have much money left for everything else.
True.
Right? In fact, in the case of Kenya, you have over about 86% of your expenditure. It's on wages, pensions, and interest payment. Right? These few alone takes the largest chunk of your public expenditure, and that means that you have very little left to build roads, to invest in schools, and to create more healthcare facilities, right? So I think it is that sort of issue that one needs to look at. Obviously, that's a structural issue. That's to a large extent it's determined by both by the structure of the economy, but more important currently by the structure of your fiscal policies.
And we'll get into the fiscal policy in a little bit. But Kenya owes the World Bank maybe about 13 billion shillings. But correct me if I'm wrong, I know you have the right numbers. What happens in the event of a default on our part?
No, I do hope, let me first talk about this issue of default. We all know very well, if you look at the experience from across the world, and there's some very, very good empirical research on this. People looked at the over 200 episodes of default in the last few decades across the world. Every time you have a default, on average, it's actually going to cause a reduction in your GDP growth. It's going to cause a significant increase in your poverty rate, and actually also has impacts on things like infant mortality and other human development indicators. So default is really, I don't think it's an option for Kenya, and I think we should try to do everything we can to avoid a default.
But in the event that it does happen?
No, look, I think clearly, when countries get into a default, there will be one is that you're not going to get any more new funding from anybody, right? So then you need to get into a restructuring process, which can take time. So I think this is, again, my point is I think we should try to do everything we can to avoid a default. And the way to do that is really, one, clearly you need to continue to increase your domestic revenue on the revenue side. And two, Kenya needs to look at where you spend your money. We just talked about the structure of the spending, and I think there's significant rooms for improvement in terms of improving the efficiency and equity of public expenditure. And third, and more importantly, and this is what this our public finance report says, it's you also need to undertake some of the much needed structural reforms, including addressing some of the governance issues, making the investment climate much more conducive, particularly to attract private investment, both domestic and foreign, so that you can actually have an economy that grows much faster, much more inclusive, in the sense that everybody can benefit from the economy, and most importantly, that you can create more and better jobs. For me, I think the biggest challenge Kenya faces today, it's actually the lack of jobs.
That's true.
Right.
And we'll talk about the lack of jobs a little bit. I was asking about the default because conditionalities for loans from the World Bank are often very vague. People don't have an understanding of them. So then we don't know what does happen in the event of default. What are the conditionalities for the loans? How are the terms set? How are, credit, how is credit rating done? All of those things, they operate in just a lot of opaqueness. Can you shed any light on any of those things? Conditionalities for loans, credit rating as well, and yes, actually let's start with those two and then we can move.
Let me start by saying that I think every single penny, every cent of loan we make to Kenya is made public. All the terms, the duration of those loans are on our website. So there's nothing that's opaque about World Bank financing to Kenya. And I wanted to make it absolutely clear that since Kenya joined the World Bank back in 1964, the World Bank has provided a total of some $25 billion of loans, credits. These credits are some very low interest or zero interest credits and grants. The financing provided by the World Bank to Kenya is the best you can get from anywhere for Kenya, right? There is no other better sources in terms of the duration. All the loans we provide are long-term, right? They're provided to fund education, healthcare, agriculture, transport, your energy sector, you name it, right? So these are loans, grants that are made to Kenya to invest in the country's long-term development.
All right. Everything is on the website, including any conditionalities that require policy change from the Kenyan government. That would also be accessible?
Absolutely, right? So we have, basically from the World Bank side, we have three types of instruments that we use, or type of loans. The first one is really what we call investment project financing, and that's financing provided to finance a particular project, say in education, right? We've helped to finance in the last few decades over 30,000 school classrooms, right? And we've helped to finance thousands of kilometers of paved roads. And one of the examples is the Nairobi to Mombasa road, where we financed through the last couple of decades upgrades and maintenance, right? And we've invested one of your first hydropower on the Tana River. And Kenya today has one of the highest share of green energy. And large part of that is your thermal energy, geothermal. right? And that accounts for about, 45% of your overall energy capacity. And I'm very proud to say that the World Bank has helped to finance half of that geothermal generating capacity. So that's one type of loans we make to finance specific projects, particularly both infrastructure, but also in human development, in education, in healthcare. Right? And the second type is what we call program for results. And that's a type of, if you can call it a condition. The condition is that you achieve certain results. That is, say, in education. We provide you a, say, $400 or $500 million loan, and the condition is that you achieve certain results in terms of the number of girls, the number of young people enrolled, right? And the quality of the education, the retentions, and all of that. So that's the other type, which is really very much tied. In other words, we pay for results that the country achieves. I think that's a good way of doing it.
So is it milestone based?
They're not just milestone. They're really, yes, milestone based in the sense that, obviously that payments is made throughout the duration of the project, normally 5-6 years, right? So yes, whenever you achieve these results, you can then send an application to withdraw that money from us. I think that's a very good way, so that we make absolutely sure that that financing goes to the intended results you wanted to achieve.
Okay.
Right? And
who selects these, before you go to the third one? Who selects the projects that you're going to finance in this particular case? Is it the World Bank coming to say, we see from our reports you need to improve your healthcare, and so we are coming up with some financing into your health system, which will be a program for results? Or is it the government that says we need to improve our health system, and we're coming to the World Bank and saying finances for it?
Okay, that's an excellent question, right? The way we do business, and again, goes back to this issue of evidence-based. We do a lot of analytical work, look at the economy, look at what are the key challenges in the country, and look at where the investment needs are. We then go to the government. The government has its own development strategy. We discuss with the government. The government says, out of these, we would like the World Bank to support us in this area, in education, in health, in energy, in transport. We then look at, do we, at the World Bank, have that comparative advantage? In other words, is this an area where we feel we have the expertise, we have the experience to work on? So in the end, that selection of projects is really the overlap between what the government's, the country's priorities are, and everything we support has to be a priority for the country. But that doesn't mean that we support each and every priority, because we won't have that capacity to finance each and every priority. So we take that subset where we feel that we have the comparative advantage and we have the financial resources to support.
Okay, third one.
So the third one, it's really what we call, and quite often I think in the media report as budget support or development policy operations. And there is what we do is that the government has a reform program. Say we wanted to undertake fiscal reforms. We have debt issues. We wanted to reform our public finance system. He said, here's what we're going to do. The government sets out a set of policies. They said, we wanted to put in place the Treasury single account. We want to put in place a e-government procurement system. So we provide financing. So if you've done this, they're called prior actions, then we go provide that financing to support you to implement those reforms. So that's a third part, which is really to support policy reforms that a country wants to undertake.
Government, whether it's anecdotally or evidence, has been known, the Kenya government, to mismanage funds. How do you make a case to keep lending to a government that mismanages where there's mismanagement of finances? And that's a broad question. I know it speaks to tracking. I know it speaks to, I don't know, whatever data or science or measurement, but there is evidence to show that the Kenya government oftentimes either there's inflated projects, there's ghost projects, there's projects that don't get complete, and you still see, for example, the World Bank lending. How do you make a case to lend to a government that misappropriates funds?
I think what we do, it's first, I think, think about 3 different levels. At the country level, so that we help the country to improve its public financial management system overall. I think that's a very, very important one. It's not just the finance we provide, so that, you know, the things I talked about, supporting the country to put in place. They haven't completely done it yet. It's Treasury single account. The government is planning to roll out a e-government procurement system that will help to improve transparency and to improve the kind of controls you talk about. So that's at the country level, the system level. We need to help the country to develop these, and we provide, you know, financing for that type of, I just talked about the policies, but also actual institution building. Right? And second one, it's really for us to think about that help to improve the systems at the sector level. Right? Take education. This is a sector where we've been supporting Kenya for the last few decades. We've had probably a dozen or so projects and programs. In addition to building the schools, we've helped Kenya to really to put in place a teacher training system, right? And curriculum development, competency-based curriculum and competency-based assessment. These are the sort of systems at the sector level which are also important about making sure that that funding actually goes to the schools. And the third one, which is, I think we're actually very proud of the fact that, you know, the World Bank has probably one of the highest standards when it comes to fiduciary responsibility. We have a very transparent, a very clearly defined procurement policy, process and procedures for the projects we finance. Right? We put in place a very strict financial management system, and we have our teams regularly monitor the implementation of those policies. So at the actual project level, we make sure that, again, that funding goes to exactly what it's intended to.
We take a break, we come back. I still think that there's a question here that's still underlying. That do you monitor to see when, for example, a country's debt is getting to an unsustainable level? Do those red flags inform the World Bank to say, all right, we're going to halt any further support of your projects until we have a conversation, and so on and so forth? But let's take a break. We'll be back shortly. Qimiao Fan is the World Bank Country Director for Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, and Uganda. He's here today to explain to us how the World Bank operates and also the relationship between the World Bank and the government of Kenya, plus Kenya's debt dilemma. Back in a moment.
There we go. I know we have feedback as we get into the conversation. Jenga Njogu says, is it true that the World Bank has given Kenya strict measures? Since on the 13th of June, there was a forum occasioned by PS Diaspora, and all I heard in that forum was the hawking of bills and bonds from CBK. Borrowing when GDP is at risk is a short-term fix to avoid bigger pain. Can you stop loaning to Kenya? That is still Mike the One. Right. Feedback coming in from outside.
Yeah, and it's back to Eric's question.
I think the question I would ask is, would you like more schools to be built in Kenya? Would you like your kids to go to a classroom that's safe, that's conducive to learning? Would you like to go to a health clinic or a hospital where you can get decent health care? Would you like to have better roads when you travel, when your kids go to school, or when you wanted to take your goods to the market, right? And that's what we do. And that's what the financing is provided by the World Bank to Kenya. Again, let me emphasize, I think every country in the world borrows money to finance its expenditure, finance its development. As I said, the question is, there's nothing inherently wrong about borrowing, about debt. It's really what you use that debt for. If you are using that debt to invest in your education, your healthcare, your transport, in your energy sector, that can help your economy to grow faster, that's good debt, right? So I think the question is really that, we should be asking ourselves, is that debt used to produce the kind of results that we want, whether it's improvement in our education, in our healthcare, or are we getting better growth, right? I think that's the question to ask, and I think it's, in the end, is what you use that debt for that's going to determine whether ultimately, and whether you should be borrowing more or not.
Yeah, I'll then take you back to what we've been doing as a country. In around 2003, there was a policy document that was produced by the government of Kenya that was economic policy for wealth creation, and a policy for wealth creation and economic development. And then we came with a Vision 2030 blueprint that was basically, all of them are geared towards improving Kenya's economy, growing Kenya's economy into a middle-income industrializing country that has job creation, that has better livelihoods for the people. Okay? Where we are at in 2025, despite improvements in Kenya's macroeconomic indicators, this country of ours continues to face structural challenges, including insufficient job creation and low wages, especially among the youth. And I'm quoting a gentleman called Qimiao, the World Bank Division Director for Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, and Uganda. This is something that you said in May. So we are not where we ought to have been, to answer your question. Despite our debt levels rising to over 10 trillion shillings. So when I go to the bank today and I am coming in with a lot of debt, the bank asks me, so you are heavily in debt. What's your capacity to pay? What do you want to borrow this money for? Can I see evidence that there are the money that you borrowed from my sister bank there, or you borrowed from me, you actually put it to good use, and I can clearly see you've come here, you're in tattered clothes, you don't look like you've eaten in the last 2 weeks, you are not doing as well as you said you wanted to do. I'm not going to lend you more.
Well, I think that's a very legitimate question, right? But I go back to what I said earlier. I think the question is, obviously, Kenya is a sovereign. You decide where you wanted to borrow, right? Having said that, I think it's important to note and for me to reiterate the fact that the money from the World Bank is the lowest cost you can ever get for Kenya. So I think the choice is really between getting low cost, sometimes zero interest loans from the World Bank versus Kenya going to the market to borrow, whether domestically or externally, right? Your domestic government borrowing is actually quite expensive. So it's not the World Bank's loans that are making your debt situation worse. It's the other sources. And in fact, it's the World Bank's loans because it's so highly concessional and it's long-term, it's actually helping Kenya to manage your debt better. Right. So I think that's very, very important for all of us to bear in mind when we look at the financing from the World Bank.
I think what we trade in interest rates, we give up in sovereignty and policy. And I like that you use the word sovereign, because now that brings in the other issue, which is some of the conditionalities that come with the loans. They do interfere sometimes with the sovereignty of a country. Sometimes it's, yes, more funding for education and very positive things, and that's all well and good. Other times it's fuel subsidies, it's things like that people genuinely are against, right? And so it brings the issue of how does the World Bank impact a country from a policy perspective, is that interfering with sovereignty of the people, for example? Last year we saw a finance bill that was largely rejected. And then you wonder, okay, what is at play behind some of these new taxes or new fiscal policy measures that we are seeing come to fore, and does that interfere with our sovereignty? Would it be better to just take the high interest loans and get to set our own fiscal policy? And I know you'll say that it is the countries that come with these reforms and they look for financing from the World Bank, but I do think it's a chicken and egg situation. They know that if they do start to institute some of these changes, they will get funding from the World Bank. So then, yeah, chicken and egg and the sovereignty of countries.
I actually disagree with that assertion. I think it's if you think that asking countries to make sure that the money we provide is used transparently, we require, yes, for the financing we provide, we say you need to go to do competitive bidding for public procurement. If you think that's an interference in your sovereignty,
no, not that.
That's right. I don't think that it is, right?
Not competitive
bidding. But that's the kind of conditions we ask. And that's when you go to a commercial bank, you ask for a loan, they're going to be asking you, they're going to be monitoring the use of that loan. I think that's a fiduciary responsibility. It's for the interest of the borrower, right? To make sure that loan is used for its intended purposes. And as for policy, as I said earlier, the policies that we support are not imposed by us. These are policies that the government has in its own reform program. They wanted to do, right? If countries wanted to. I think, take this example you just gave on fuel subsidies. Not all fuel subsidies are good, right? Why do you want it to provide by providing fuel subsidies across the board, either by controlling prices, that for everybody to get a subsidized fuel? The millionaire, the billionaire don't need that subsidy. That subsidy should be given targeted to those who actually need it. So I think even on the kind of subsidy policy you're talking about, I think we need to think about that in the end, is that policy actually helping to solve the problems you have, right? I actually think a blanket subsidy, for example, the current fertilizer subsidy, I actually don't think is a very good one because it's not targeted, right? The subsidy should be targeted to the smallholder farmers who actually need it. There's no reason why you should be subsidizing those billionaire or millionaire farmers.
But you see my issue with the sovereignty question. It's not that I'm doubting the soundness of the economic policy. It's the imposition of them in exchange for these concessional, low interest loans.
No, that's not an imposition at all. In the sense, as I say, it's the other way round. It's a government says, we wanted to undertake these policy reforms, and I need help, right? If you wanted, the government says, we wanted to further increase our public expenditure on education because we want to build more schools, we want to hire more teachers, more qualified teachers, it needs more money. Right? And that's the type of things we support. You think that's an imposition? If supporting the country, no, it's actually not a chicken and egg thing at all.
It's putting logic on the table.
Yes, I actually think you've got that completely wrong. I think it's the fact is that if that support, that financing is to support the country, to spend more on education, building more schools. I don't think that's an imposition. That's what the government wants to do, right?
Yeah. Let me ask, I don't know if this is related, if there's any examples or countries or times when the World Bank has considered, I don't know, either suspending funding or demanding audited reports. Has there ever been such a scenario? Because that could then speak to some of the deeper issues. It could be that it's domestic based, but it made you say, hang on, we're not going to disburse just yet. We demand audited reports from this country before we can consider. Has there been such a scenario?
Yeah, let's go back to the type of loans we provide, right? For a specific project, what we do is, yes, we require annual audits of how that money is spent, right? If we find that there is corruption or misuse of that fund, yes, we will demand for that funding to be returned. So that, I think, it's the kind of conditions that we impose. It's a fiduciary requirement, which I think all of you would want it to see. You don't want us to lend money to Kenya when money is misused. When it's misused, we say, the government, you need to investigate, and we need to make sure that money is refunded. And if that situation in a particular sector, that there's more corruption and funds get misused, yes, we could suspend financing for that sector. And that happens. And we will say, we are not going to resume our financing for this sector until we see improvements in the controls that you have on how that resource is used. I think that's something that everybody should do, and that's what citizens should be asking your government, right, and your schools to do.
So where do we start?
And that's the kind of things we are expected to do, and I don't think that's an imposition.
So here is where I see as being, we are in a situation where a larger population of the country is getting more and more involved on how their country is being governed, managed. In the second term of the Uhuru Kenyatta administration, many people got onto social media, onto digital platforms, talking about, debt, and were saying, no, our debt is now becoming a bit too much, it's unsustainable. And they wrote petitions to the IMF and the World Bank saying, please, stop lending our government. Right now, there's still more conversations around the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, and saying, what kind of dealings are we having with our government? Why are we still seeing our debts rising? And I want to come back to the question I asked earlier. Do you think the citizens of Kenya misunderstand the World Bank?
Well, I think we need to do better to explain what we do better to the citizens of Kenya. As I said, I think one needs to think about why you're borrowing, right? You're borrowing because that your revenues, your domestic revenues, are not sufficient to meet your expenditure. And some of this expenditure goes to pay for your education, for your health. Some of this goes to invest in infrastructure, right? So there's always a question of how much should you be borrowing to invest in those areas that's much, much needed for the country to grow, to develop, right? So I think that's where one needs to think about is why you're borrowing is because you don't have enough domestic revenues. So the choice for you, for anybody, for any country, is then to decide, okay, we are just going to not borrow at all, either domestically or externally, and we're just going to rely entirely on our domestic revenue to grow. That's an option. You can do that. Very few countries can do that. Almost every country borrows, either domestically or externally, to fund its development, right? So then I think the question is really that how much should you be borrowing? What should you be borrowing that money for? And how are you going to be used, the proceeds from that borrowing? That, I think, it's an area where we should be everybody should be focused on. And that goes back to the question of, I think, one, the transparency for that borrowing. Right? You need to make it absolutely transparent, the terms of those loans. As I say, every single World Bank loan, it's published, the terms of those loans on our website. Everybody can look at it. Right? And we encourage countries, every country, to actually make each and every borrowing they have public. the terms of those loans transparent.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's the sort of issues we should be focused on. And in terms of why does the World Bank still lend to Kenya? I think the question is really, as I said, because that's the cheapest you can get. So the choice for Kenya is that, do you actually want to borrow more domestically at very high interest rate, or commercially? That's a choice, right? So that's a choice for you. You're telling me that Kenya should stop borrowing from the World Bank because it's the cheapest, or because it's it imposes very strict fiduciary conditions. That's a choice you have to make. So in other words, you're saying that you wanted Kenya to be borrowing at high interest rates from the market, either domestically or externally, and stop borrowing from the World Bank. Now, we are not going to be saying that you have to borrow from us. That's not the case, right? It's because we have also these concessional resources. These low interest loans are very, very limited, right? So we actually also have to make choice.
Right.
You have a finite pot.
Absolutely, right? Like all resources are finite.
Question on the credit ratings. There's concerns about how Africa, the global south in general, gets rated by credit rating agencies, and how that affects now access to credit, cost of credit, all those things. And while the World Bank's loans are, like you said, low interest, very concessional, still there's concerns about those. What are your views on
Why
that?
would you still have concerns about low interest loans as compared to the high interest borrowing you have? I don't understand, right? What is the concern? You're saying you're concerned about you actually paying low interest and it's taking you a long time to pay back?
This is just asking from a fiscal perspective around the credit ratings for the global south. And this is not a World
Now, that's a
Bank- it's not
different issue.
yes, yes,
That's
it's
a
not
different
World
issue,
Bank
right?
specific
So that's a
issue.
different
Yes.
issue.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on credit rating, and it's probably inappropriate for me to comment on how these credit agencies are done,
Okay.
right? And that's a system that's been there where everybody follows. We ourselves, the World Bank, we're rated by these credit rating agencies, right? So, and I think what it is really important, clearly that that we also understand how credit agencies rate different countries and different companies. That applies not just to countries, but also to companies, right? And similarly, you have your commercial banks, when you go to borrow, they look at your credit score. So one needs to understand how these scores are made up, right? And what sort of data do they use? Therefore, it's important, I believe, for credit rating agencies to also to be very transparent on the sort of criteria they use. And we do our economic assessments of countries. You can, each and every of this report, it's published, right? So in that, I think, again, this issue of transparency, I believe it's really, really important, not just in terms of the debt itself, the terms of the debt need to be transparent. It's also important that the way countries are rated on their credit scores are also transparent.
When you look at, even from the reports that you have, Kenya's economy continues to grow. What they say, the macroeconomics, stabilization of the shilling, stabilization of inflation as well, and bringing down of the inflation. They seem to be improving, but there are still gaps. There are gaps in terms of, at the personal level, whether the economy is growing. You share these reports with the government. What's your advice, for example, to Kenya at this point? How should Kenya manage its economy so that it starts serving more people, creates more job opportunities, and gives more social services?
Look, I think if one looks at the various indicators of Kenya's economy, clearly you've been able to maintain a very stable exchange rate. You've been able to increase your reserves. Now it's over $11 billion, almost 5 months of your import cover. And inflation has been down and kept stable now. So all these indicators, I think, are very good, right? And that these are important macro indicators and important for investors. At the same time, I think the key challenge in the economy at this moment, it's actually the thing we talked about quite a lot. That's the fiscal side, right? The debt levels. Kenya needs to continue to reduce its debt levels. It has made progress, but clearly more needs to be done. But more importantly, I think Kenya needs to look at what are some of the key structural challenges it's facing in the economy. Clearly, the country needs to continue to invest in infrastructure, right? Whether it's the traffic jams, not just in Nairobi, the traffic jams along the Mombasa-Nairobi road, right? The cost of your logistics are still high. And what all of these add up to the high cost of doing business. And there are issues also on the fiscal side, on your tax policies. There are too frequent changes, they're too complex in some cases. And there are, as our report indicates, there are probably also too many exemptions, right? And at a time when you actually need to increase your domestic revenue, these expenditure, tax expenditures are not helpful. So I think clearly you need to work on improving your domestic revenue. You need to think about how you can make your public expenditure more effective. And more importantly, I think Kenya needs to start addressing some of the key structural bottlenecks, particularly including governance issues in the economy.
Very well said. Thank you very much, Qimiao. I hope they heard you. At least we have. And we're going to make sure that we ask these questions to the people who are concerned. Qimiao Fan is the World Bank Country Director for Kenya and also for Rwanda, Somalia, and Uganda. He's been our guest. We've been talking about Kenya's economic situation, Kenya's debt situation, Kenya's structural issues in terms of finance, that and more. Keep it here for more conversations. In the next hour, we'll talk about this reckless talk and what it means to the country. It's coming up to 8 a.m.